December 2010. A construction crew is working a job along Ocean Parkway on Long Island, New York. The road runs along a narrow strip of barrier beach between the Atlantic and the Great South Bay. It is not a place where people live. It is a highway people use to get somewhere else. Summer traffic headed toward the Hamptons, commuters, beach day families. The kind of road you have driven 100 times without looking at what is alongside it. The crew found a body. Then investigators swept the area more thoroughly. Then they found more. 4 women, each wrapped in burlap, each positioned carefully in a stretch of highway shoulder, less than half a mile long. The medical examiner determined they had been there for months, some of them for over a year, lying on the side of one of Long Island's most heavily trafficked roads while tens of thousands of cars went past without stopping. The women were Melissa Barthelemy, 24, Megan Waterman, 22, Amber Lynn Costello, 27, Maureen Brainard-Barnes, 25. All of them had advertised escort services online. All of them had disappeared at different points across a roughly 2-year window. All of them had families who had been searching. The case became known as the Gilgo Beach murders. For 13 years, no one was charged. In July 2023, a 59-year-old architect named Rex Heuermann was arrested on a Midtown Manhattan sidewalk as he was walking to Penn Station to catch a train home to his family in Massapequa Park, about 40 minutes south of where those 4 women were found. He has pleaded not guilty to all charges. The proceedings are ongoing, but the forensic trail that led investigators to Heuermann after a decade of institutional failure is one of the most technically remarkable investigative stories of the past 20 years. And at the center of it, the pivot point. The detail that finally closed the gap between a DNA profile and a name was a piece of pizza crust pulled from a trash can. I want to explain exactly how that happened, because the science matters, and because once you understand it, the case means something different than it does when it is summarized as a headline. Rex Heuermann did not look like the person investigators had been theoretically hunting since 2010. He ran his own architecture firm, RH Consultants, out of an office on Fifth Avenue. He had projects across the country. He was large, physically 6'4", and he made the commute from the suburbs into the city regularly. He was married. He had children. When Suffolk County investigators finally searched his home, his wife and kids were in Montana on vacation. They were notified by phone. What the search produced is still partly subject to evidentiary proceedings. I am not going to detail everything, because some of it has not been formally entered into the public record in a way I'm comfortable treating as settled. What I will say is that the picture that emerged was not of a man whose home gave no indication of what the charges allege. It was not a surprising residence once you understood what investigators believed they were looking for. The double life Heuermann had maintained, ordinary suburban commuter by day, the other thing investigators allege he was by night, was not invisible. It had simply never been examined closely. For 13 years, nobody looked closely enough. That is the institutional piece of this story, and I want to deal with it directly before we get into the forensics, because the forensic story is genuinely impressive, and it would be easy to let it overshadow what it took so long to produce. When the bodies were found in late 2010 and early 2011, the case drew national attention immediately. This was not a remote rural discovery. These women were found on Long Island, within sight distance of one of the most densely populated metropolitan areas in the country. The case had everything: multiple victims, a potential serial offender, a geography that made it all worse, not better. The Suffolk County Police Department had primary jurisdiction. What followed was criticized, consistently for years, by families and advocates and journalists, as an investigation that moved too slowly, followed too few leads aggressively, and treated the victims with less urgency than they deserved. The specific criticism that came back repeatedly was that because the 4 women had advertised escort services, the investigation was handled with a level of institutional disinterest that would not have applied to different women in different circumstances. I want to be fair about this. It is genuinely difficult to assess a long, cold case investigation from the outside. Investigators often know things they cannot disclose. Resources are finite. Some failures that look like negligence from the outside are, on closer inspection, genuine investigative dead ends. But the families of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Lynn Costello, and Maureen Brainard-Barnes spent over a decade being told the case was active. A decade of limited information. A decade of watching it not move. And Lynn Costello's roommate had reportedly told investigators before Amber disappeared that a man matching Heuermann's general physical description had come to their residence looking for her. That detail sat in the investigative record for years. In 2021, new leadership came into Suffolk County's commissioner role. A dedicated task force was assembled. State and federal coordination was brought in. Cold case specialists with specific expertise in investigative genetic genealogy, a technique that barely existed in its current form when the bodies were found, were integrated into the process. What they built over the next 2 years was the case that put Rex Heuermann on a Manhattan sidewalk in handcuffs on July 13, 2023. But let me explain the technology that made it possible, because most people have only a partial understanding of it. The standard model for DNA evidence in criminal cases works like this. Biological material is found at a crime scene, a genetic profile is extracted. That profile is run against CODIS, the National DNA Database, which holds profiles from convicted offenders and some people who have been arrested. If the crime scene profile matches someone in CODIS, investigators have a name. Rex Heuermann was not in CODIS. He had no prior arrests, no criminal record, no law enforcement contact that would have put his DNA into any database. So, the conventional approach was simply not available here. What investigators had going into this phase of the case was a detailed genetic profile of whoever had left biological material at the crime scenes. A precise biological fingerprint attached to no name. Investigative genetic genealogy takes a different path. Instead of comparing the crime scene profile against a database of criminal records, forensic genealogists upload it to consumer DNA platforms. Services like GED Match, where people voluntarily submit their genetic information for ancestry purposes. The algorithm searches for partial matches, not perfect matches, partial ones. People who share some percentage of the unknown profile's genetic material, which means they are related to whoever left it. Maybe distantly, maybe by several degrees. From those partial matches, genealogists build backward and forward through family trees. They use publicly available records, obituaries, birth and marriage certificates, census data, property records, to map out relationships, identify family branches, eliminate lines that don't fit the geography or the timeline, and narrow the field from dozens of potential relatives down to a smaller group of candidates. This process can take months. It is part genetics, part archival detective work, part patient elimination of wrong answers. It does not produce a suspect. It produces a list of people who might be the suspect, based on genetic relationship and consistent circumstances. The final step is obtaining a confirmed sample from the top candidate to prove the match. That is where the pizza crust becomes the story. By the time investigators had completed the genealogical analysis, court filings and reporting from the New York Times, Newsday, and other outlets indicate they had identified Heuermann as a strong candidate. The genetic relationships mapped by the analysis, combined with his geography, his employment, his physical description, it all landed on him. But strong candidate is not the same as confirmed suspect. To confirm, you need biological material from the specific person, and you need to obtain it without tipping them off. An arrest before the DNA confirmation is an arrest you cannot make with confidence. You need the science to close. So investigators surveilled him. They documented his movements between Massapequa Park and his Fifth Avenue office. They watched what he discarded. They waited for a moment when he would leave behind something that contained his DNA. A cigarette butt, a coffee cup, anything. He ordered pizza at a meeting. He ate the pizza. He threw away the crust. An investigator retrieved it from the trash. The DNA extracted from that crust, from a piece of discarded food thrown out by a man who had no idea anyone was watching, matched the profile recovered from the crime scenes. 13 years. 13 years of these four families not knowing. And the bridge between not knowing and knowing turned out to be a pizza crust in a Manhattan trash can. The DNA was the confirmation, but the charging documents contain other evidence that deserves attention, because it fills in the picture in ways that are hard to dismiss. Investigators allege that around the periods when the victims disappeared, Heuermann used prepaid cell phones, burner phones, purchased with cash, unregistered, that showed up in locations consistent with the investigative theory of the case and then went silent. The pattern is specific. These weren't phones that appeared in his regular daily movements. They activated in places and at times that fit, according to the filings, and then stopped. After each relevant window, the prepaid phone went dark and his primary personal device resumed normal usage. Cell towers record what pings them. Carriers retain metadata. When investigators mapped the activation and location pattern of those prepaid phones against Heuermann's confirmed movements, what they found, according to the charging documents, was not coincidence. That is the framing prosecutors are working with. A defense will contest it. That is how this is supposed to work. But placed alongside the DNA confirmation and the behavioral history, the cell data contributes to a picture that is documented, specific, and now part of the public record. I want to take a moment here, not as a structural device, but because these four women have too often been treated as supporting characters in their own case. Melissa Barthelemy was from upstate New York, from a family that loved her. She had a younger sister. Her family reported her missing in 2009 and spent over a year looking for her before her body was found. Megan Waterman was 22 and from Maine. She had a daughter. Lynn Costello was 27 and had been through hard years, addiction, instability, but she had people around her who cared about her and who raised alarm immediately when she stopped responding. Maureen Brainard-Barnes had a young child. She was last seen in New York City in 2007 and wasn't found until 2010. These were not abstractions. They were people whose circumstances made them more vulnerable to whoever did this, and that vulnerability was understood and, according to investigators, deliberately exploited. The suggestion that their circumstances also made them less deserving of the same investigative urgency applied to other victims is one of the more uncomfortable things this case asks us to look at directly. The forensic story is genuinely remarkable. What it took so long to produce is genuinely tragic. Both can be true, and both deserve equal space in how we understand this case. Rex Heuermann has pleaded not guilty. He has not been convicted. Nothing in this script is a verdict. What this case does represent, regardless of what the proceedings ultimately determine, is a proof of concept for investigative genetic genealogy applied to long, cold cases with preserved biological evidence. The technique was used earlier, most famously in the identification of the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, in 2018. But the Heuermann case shows what happens when genealogical DNA is combined with sustained modern digital forensics, multi-agency coordination, and the patience to build a case slowly enough to do it right, including spending weeks surveilling a man's lunch habits to obtain a DNA sample without alerting him. That investigative patience is worth noting. It is not glamorous. It is watching and waiting for someone to throw something away. What it also shows is what 13 years of delayed application of those tools costs. 4 families in limbo. At least 4 women unaccounted for while the person investigators believe killed them continued commuting into Manhattan, attending to his office on Fifth Avenue, and catching the train home to his family in the suburbs. The technology to identify him through genealogical DNA existed in earlier forms. For a meaningful portion of that period, the question of why the investigation wasn't resourced and structured in a way that applied it sooner, what combination of institutional inertia, resource constraints, and attitudinal factors about the victims contributed to the delay, is a question Suffolk County has not fully answered, and the families of these 4 women have not stopped asking. The detail people remember about this case is the pizza crust. I understand why. There is something almost absurd about it. A careful man, apparently methodical in how he conducted his private life for over a decade, undone by a Tuesday lunch. But the detail worth sitting with, longer than the pizza crust, is the timeline itself. Not the forensic timeline that runs from DNA to arrest. The other one, the one that begins in December 2010 when a construction crew finds a body on the side of a highway, and ends in July 2023 when an investigator approaches a man on a midtown sidewalk with handcuffs. In between those 2 dates is 13 years, 4 families, multiple investigative failures that took too long to be corrected. A suspect who, if what investigators allege is true, attended to his suburban life 40 minutes from where those women were found and was never looked at closely. The forensic work that finally broke this case was extraordinary. There is genuine skill and patience in what the task force assembled between 2021 and 2023. The 13 years before that is what needs to be asked about, directly, persistently, without accepting institutional distance as an answer. These 4 women deserve better than 13 years. This video was produced using publicly available court documents, charging filings, official statements from the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, and verified reporting from the New York Times, Newsday, ABC News, and other outlets. Rex Heuermann has pleaded not guilty to all charges and is presumed innocent. Analysis and editorial opinion were identified as such throughout. This is documentary and educational content. It is not a legal conclusion. If you've been following this case since the 2010 discovery or since the 2023 arrest, subscribe. We'll stay with the proceedings as they develop. One thing I keep returning to, investigators reportedly had Heuermann as a strong genealogical candidate before they ever retrieved the pizza crust, which means there was a window, potentially weeks, between the family tree pointing at him and the DNA confirmation closing the case. How that window was managed, what it looked like operationally, and what it tells us about how this kind of investigation can be run more efficiently going forward. I'd be curious what others who've followed the forensic timeline closely think about that gap.